Today we're going to be ranking every single Soulsborne DLC boss from Dark Souls 1 all the way to Bloodborne. And maybe I'll update this one when Elden Ring's DLC comes out in like 2026. But until then, if you need a reminder not to give up, Skeleton, make sure to cop a shirt, link in the pinned comment. Starting with the worst DLC boss in the series, I don't think anyone's going to disagree with me here. We have the Gank Squad. Now, I've said before that I actually don't hate this boss. I kind of just take it as a troll and accept it for what it is, but I can't deny the fact that it's just a super lazy boss. With the DLC being something you paid extra to get, it's hard for me not to be a little bit upset when I get a fight like this. The Gank Squad could have been better if they made it a little bit easier to separate the three, but I feel like I never get time to get more than one hit in at a time before the other two catch up to me. I don't think it's the hardest fight in the world, but it's just frustrating trying to run around and separate one from the pack only to get a single hit in at a time. The fight takes forever, and since most of your time is spent running around, this is a low tier boss fight for me, giving it the lowest spot on this list. Next up, we have a close second for the worst boss in the Soulsborne DLCs, and that would be Luden's-Zahlen. I want to say this rating is partially because of the frigid outskirts, but it's also a lazy reskin gank that I didn't find to be a super enjoyable fight. I appreciate that they tried their timing strategy where they wait until the first one is at half health before the other one comes in, but it's just kind of a mess overall. Their attacks don't complement each other, and it just feels like they stuck two cats in as the boss because they couldn't come up with anything else. Not to mention, you already fought one of them earlier in the DLC in what I thought was a pretty good fight. I also think Artorias is a good fight. It doesn't mean I want to fight two of them. Luden's-Zahlen is one of my least favorite fights in the series, and I think runner-up for the worst is a fair spot for this one. Moving on, we have the Living Failures. Now, we're out of the bosses I would consider bad. They're just mid-tier and uneventful compared to the rest of the bosses on this list. The Living Failures are a gimmick that's been done time and time again and was never received super well, so putting one in the DLC was a bold choice. Luckily, you have an incredible boss right after, so it doesn't quite feel like a wasted opportunity. I don't think the Failures are a super fun fight though. You basically just run around separating them and taking one out at a time until the health bar runs out. They don't really have any crazy attacks, just some melee and magic here and there, so it doesn't ever give me too much trouble. Disappointing, but nothing too terrible. And sticking with that theme, next up we have Half-Light Spear of the Church. I always find this one difficult to rank because it really depends on who gets summoned in for the fight, but it tends to be pretty underwhelming either way. I don't love the fact that I have to take out the other NPC throughout the fight every time as well. I would have rather had them just balance the fight a little bit better to have a cool PvP 1v1. This fight tends to be on the easier side, especially if you're playing online and summon in the NPC, so I think putting it around the spot makes sense. The connection is what makes this fight frustrating for me, but I guess that's the case for all online play in these games. I do appreciate the idea of having a PvP boss though. I personally like the old monk a little bit better, but it's still a fun idea, just not as great for a DLC boss. And sometimes you'll get a dude who's just insane at the game, like you can tell this man never moved on from Dark Souls 3, and that's always just real fun. But staying on Dark Souls 3, next up we have the Champions Gravetender and Gravetender Great Wolf. This fight isn't as bad as I used to think. It's just hard to give it much praise with all the other bosses that follow it. I think it can be decently fun, but most of the time I find it way too easy for this point in the game. I do always like an NPC battle, but having to take out wolves in the beginning and stress over a giant wolf spawning in later is more than I wanted to deal with. This fight feels more like a basic level encounter as opposed to a boss. In fact, they probably could have just taken the health bar away and no one would have even noticed it was supposed to be a boss. But obviously this fight is fine. We just expect excellence from the Dark Souls 3 DLCs, and for the most part, that is what we got. Next on our list, we have Elena from Dark Souls 2. I always put this boss in the middle of the pack because she wasn't super memorable or necessarily enjoyable for me. The only thing I remember being upset about is how constant her summoning was, and not to mention she can also just casually summon in Velstadt. But not to say I don't like this fight, I always just thought of it as pretty average. I think she could be an interesting challenge at times, but honestly, I don't love trying to deal with bosses while smaller enemies like skeletons chase me around the entire fight. I think trying to dodge her attacks and combos are fun, but to be fair, if she wasn't able to summon on top of that, she'd be one of the easiest bosses in the DLC. I do find it interesting that this fight isn't always talked about a ton, and I know a lot of people still consider her underrated, but it's still a mid-tier boss fight for me personally, so let's move on. At our next spot, we have Ava, the King's Pet. Here's the point in the list where I think I would consider every boss past this point to be good overall. Ava is a rare moment for me where I actually enjoy fighting an animal as the boss. I think they designed all the attacks pretty well while still making it decently challenging. My main problem with these fights usually is not being able to see what's going on or just getting turned around when they jump all over the place like the Gravetender Great Wolf, but I didn't have this issue with Ava. There is a lot of jumping around in this fight, but nothing that feels out of nowhere and unmanageable. I also like the additional element of Ava being invisible until you find a particular item, because it goes back to the classic FromSoft formula of if it feels too hard, you probably did something wrong, which I think in this case we all learned the hard way. This fight always gives me a rush, and I think the arena was created perfectly for this battle as well. I remember a lot of people mentioning they didn't like this fight when I was playing Dark Souls 2 for the first time, but I was pleasantly surprised by it. Maybe everyone was just salty about Lud and Zalin coming up later though, who knows. But moving on to our next spot here, we have the Sanctuary Guardian from Dark Souls 1. I think this is one of the more underrated fights in the series, but partially I think it's just because of how good the other DLC bosses are in this game. The Sanctuary Guardian has a pretty unique design and is a solid challenge as well. None of its attacks are super unpredictable, but its aggression always catches me off guard, which is good because you'll need to be prepared for that in the rest of the DLC. I do get a bit frustrated in this fight at times because of that, but I think it's more just because Dark Souls 1 is a slower game. Either way, this fight keeps us in the good category of this list. Let's move on to Bloodborne. At this spot, I'm gonna put Lawrence. I know a lot of people feel strongly about this fight, and a lot of people seem to hate it, but I kinda just consider it middle of the pack. I've said it before, it's a cleric beast, meaning it's essentially the same moveset as the tutorial boss, but much harder. Even though I didn't love this fight, I still think it's a pretty good quality boss overall, and I did find it more enjoyable than I expected. The screams are annoying as fuck though. I'd say this is a pretty average design. If it weren't for the insane last phase transition, I was not a fan of this phase at all, but it did add some variety that I wasn't expecting. The lava makes it super frustrating, sometimes forcing you to wait and bait, which kind of goes against everything Bloodborne has taught you. But either way, I've never felt too strongly about this fight in either direction, but I still think it's a solid fight overall. Moving on to Dark Souls 2, we have Sin the Slumbering Dragon. I think this boss is super underrated. I've seen it get praise here and there, but for the most part, it feels like a lot of people forget about it. This is one of my favorite dragon fights from the older Souls games, and I think they executed it super well. It didn't feel like I was chasing it down the entire fight like I normally do with the dragons in this series, and while it was a tad bit on the easy side for me, I still think it holds up as one of the better dragon bosses overall. I think the green poison theme was really unique and aesthetically pleasing, which is always a plus in the epic fights like this one. And speaking of dragons, next up on this list, we have Calamite from Dark Souls 1. I know a lot of people might be upset to see this one lower on the list, but I gotta say, I was pretty underwhelmed by this fight. Granted, I finished Dark Souls 1's DLC last after beating every other Souls game, and I had heard nothing but endless praise from the community about Calamite, and I was a little disappointed. I think this is an experience I got kind of robbed of due to the time I played it, but it's still higher on this list because I can definitely respect it. Even though I don't think it's quite on par with some of the later DLC bosses, I still think it was a dragon fight done very well, and I do have a great experience every time I fight it. It was also one of the most challenging bosses in all of Dark Souls 1 for me, which is always a plus in my book. Just because my expectations were a little too high doesn't mean it isn't a great boss fight. But going back over to Dark Souls 2, next up we have the Blue Smelter Demon. I know it may be a little controversial putting him this high, but if he weren't a reskin, I think a lot of people would have a lot more love for this boss. And let's be honest, the run up to him is what really ruined it. But the Blue Smelter Demon itself is a great boss, and I always enjoy the fight way more than I expect to. The delayed attacks make it a little more challenging than its counterpart, but overall, I don't think this fight is too difficult, but I still find it really satisfying. This is also the perfect size for a boss in my opinion, not so huge that you can't see what it's doing, but big enough to feel like it's a grand fight. It's too bad I'm always so nervous throughout this entire fight because of how bad the run back is. But staying on Dark Souls 2, next up we have a super slept on boss that I've also seen more appreciation for recently, the Burnt Ivory King. This is how to do a gimmick fight and still make it cinematic. I love that how you interact with the level determines how this fight is gonna go, since you can recruit knights to fight alongside you in the first phase and seal the portals later when you fight the king himself. The first phase feels like a real battle with the knights and was definitely a risk that paid off in my opinion. I'd love to see FromSoft try this again with another boss in the future. This phase isn't too hard with help, but it's a really cool moment that makes the fight with the Burnt Ivory King even more dramatic. The king has some brutal hitboxes, but this one is one of those classic 1v1s that I love in these games, and I'm happy it's getting the credit it deserves. His weapon is so cool on top of that, and while it isn't the biggest challenge in the world, I always look forward to this fight. Moving on, let's go back to Dark Souls 1, we have Manus. This one ended up lower on the list than I expected, but I still think it's a great boss. Manus really tests your skills. Man, there is so much going on here that I find super tough to keep up with due to the pacing of this game. He's definitely one of the most satisfying fights in this game though, and everything about it makes for a perfect end to Dark Souls 1. I still hate seeing him this low on the list, but they really started optimizing the boss formula in the later games, so unfortunately I couldn't rank him any higher. Next up, we have another entry from Bloodborne. This one might make people angry, but I got Ludwig. I'm sure a lot of people wanted to see him higher, and even though I love this fight and I still think it's one of the best overall in Bloodborne, it's not quite fully top tier for me. The cinematic nature of this fight is what makes it great for me, and the second phase is absolutely insane. So much fun. But as I've said before, I never loved the beast type bosses quite as much in these games, and the first phase always always feels kind of all over the place. Still, I can't overlook how iconic this boss is, and I'm glad it cracked the top 10. And now that we're in the top 10, we're on to the really great bosses. At number 9, we're back to Dark Souls 2 with Sir Alone. We all know this is one of the top tier bosses in Dark Souls 2, and I actually had it a bit higher on this list, but it got bumped down due to its simplicity and lack of challenge for me. And don't get me wrong, simplicity can be great, but I think it makes the fight much easier and more predictable, making it difficult for me to put it higher on this list. I do love the fast-paced combat of this fight though. It's a super exhilarating battle, and I always look forward to it when I play through this game again. But still, even though it's a classic 1v1 duel that I love, it's usually a breeze and doesn't take long to get his health bar down, so he gets the number 9 spot here. Let's move on to Dark Souls 3 for number 8. I debated where to put this one a ton on this list, but for this spot, I gotta put the Demon Princes. I almost put this one higher than Midir, but I just couldn't. This is without a doubt the most slept on boss in the series, which really speaks to how great the Dark Souls 3 DLC bosses are. I still don't quite understand how they executed the first phase as a gank so well. I know they switch off on which one takes aggro, but it never feels too easy or too unfair. They also made their attacks really clear, so it's not too difficult to see what's going on, which is a huge plus for me. The second phase is incredible and super challenging. I think they nailed this boss in terms of scale and attack balance, really just a near perfect fight overall. I don't normally co-op in these games, but this one is also really fun to take down with a friend and is still challenging enough to not feel like a crutch. This boss is super underrated, so I had to rank it a bit higher. This is one of my favorites in the series for sure. And a perfect segue for number 7, for this spot I have Midir. I feel like this one may deserve to be higher, but it's not as enjoyable to me as the others on this list, even though it might be objectively better, so I bumped it down a bit. I will say this is one of the most intense and difficult fights in the series and probably gives me more relief than any other boss fight when it's over. But I still have my own gripes with Midir, even though I have grown to enjoy it. Basically, any fire-breathing attack in these games kind of annoys me. Obviously, it makes sense, but I hate feeling like the boss can fly away and do whatever they want while you're on the ground rolling for your life. But everything else about Midir is awesome. Dodging his attacks is super satisfying, jumping into the arena, panicking when he hits the second phase. All of it was done with such care, I can't help but respect this boss. Moving on to our next spot, this one might be a bit surprising, but I actually have the Fume Knight. It seems like a lot of people have a love-hate relationship with this guy, and while I did struggle to beat him a ton in my first playthrough, I loved every second of every fight. He definitely can have some bullshit hitboxes here and there, but I always think this duel is super fun and gives me the perfect challenge that I'm always looking for. I don't expect a ton of people to agree with this placement, but I always rank based on how much I enjoy the fights unless there are specific elements that I find interesting, and this has always been one of my favorites. Cracking the top 5, I gotta be honest, I wasn't expecting to put him this high on the list, but we have Artorias. After fighting him again, I realized how perfect this fight is for me. And honestly, I think the only reason it isn't ranked higher is because of the Dark Souls 1 movement. His attacks are so much fun to dodge, and this was the fight I was waiting for throughout the entirety of my first playthrough. Trying to find a window to heal in this fight feels near impossible at times, but I love the challenge and I'm always excited for it. Definitely the best boss in Dark Souls 1. Finally, moving back to Bloodborne, at the number 4 spot, I have Orphan of Cause. Even though he isn't my favorite in the entire game, I think this is about as perfect as a Bloodborne boss can be. Super challenging, incredible atmosphere, and overall just kind of terrifying. This fight is absolutely iconic, and I really think they nailed all 3 phases perfectly. I don't really have anything bad to say about this boss, but I still have 3 more that I liked better. At number 3, we have my personal favorite boss in Bloodborne, Lady Maria. I just talked about this in my last video, ranking the Bloodborne bosses overrated or underrated, but basically my only issue with Maria is that she's too easy. Other than that, this is easily the most satisfying fight in the game. The parry windows are super tight, making it awesome when you finally pull one off. It's a little easy to R1 spam here, but man, she can still be tough if you aren't ready. Either way, each phase is so awesome and unique. I think if they gave each one its own health bar like Sister Fried, it could have been even better. And speaking of Sister Fried, she's gotta be my pick for the runner-up here. She gets points for not only being a super fun fight, but also one of the longest and most challenging in the series. I will never forget fighting this boss in my first playthrough and thinking it was over after each phase was done. Man, I had no idea what I had gotten myself into. My only gripe for this boss is the second phase. It's just kind of frustrating trying to balance Fried and her father, but luckily she's a lot more passive in this phase, giving you plenty of opportunities to whittle down their health bar. The third phase is absolutely incredible and super challenging. It'll be hard to top this one in the future, but if anything will do it, it'll be Elden Ring. And moving on to our last spot, a lot of people ask me what my favorite boss in the series is, and while it did officially become Ishin for me recently, I've always said it's about tied with Gale, who takes the number 1 spot for the best DLC boss for this video. video. Something about his attacks just feel like they flow so perfectly with Dark Souls 3's combat, and the second phase is the best balance I've seen between having a lot going on but still being manageable. I don't think a lot of people will disagree with me here. Gale was the perfect end to a perfect series. And don't ask me for an outro, I